Welcome to BizTech's ESG Conversation show. Our show for today focuses around the GlobeScan Sustainability Survey 2023. The GlobeScan Sustainability Institute by ERM Survey of Experts Stakeholder Research Program captures insights from sustainability experts and charts the shifting sustainability agenda over time. Now, as the largest and longest running survey of its kind, it has tracked expert opinions on sustainable development leadership for more than 25 years. To tell us more about this, we have Chris Coulter. He's the CEO of GlobeScan, and Mark Lee, Director of the Sustainability Institute by ERM. Now, Chris and Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be with you.
Now, for a start, gentlemen, perhaps we can start with each of you giving us an overview of your organizations and what you do. We start with Chris first.
Sure, Brian. Yeah, so GlobeScan is an insights and strategy firm. We've been around for, this is our 36th year, and very much focused on trying to understand the external context and environment for companies, NGOs, and multilateral organizations to exert more leadership around sustainable development and help them be successful in the long term.
Now, Mark, tell us about Sustainability Institute.
Yeah, Brian, I am the director of the Sustainability Institute inside of ERM, as you said. ERM is the world's largest pure play sustainability consultancy. We're about 8,000 people worldwide, operating out of a little over 40 countries, work across the breadth of the corporate sustainability or ESG agenda, helping organizations from their operational level up to their boardroom with their strategy questions about all aspects of how this agenda is moving forward. And the Institute inside ERM is our in-house think tank.
And so this, while researching this interview, one of the things that blew me away was how old both your organizations are and how early you were in this sustainability conversation, which in the Asia Pacific region has really just taken hold probably in the last 10 years.
We have, and Mark and I have been doing this for a while, despite our youthful looks. And I think that's one of the things that the survey that we'll talk about is so interesting, because we have been not only looking at and trying to understand the current context and lots of dynamic things that are happening, particularly in Asia and in ASEAN specifically, that are relatively new, as you say, but there's a long history and lots of lessons to be learned across the world in the past 35, 40 years on the agenda.
And preceding my time at ERM, the organization was founded in the early 1970s. It picked up on one of the trends that preceded my and Chris's work in this space, which was the very early kind of movement of governments to establish things like the Clean Air Act, the EPA in the US, and the kind of regulatory push that moved through North America and Europe at that time that companies found themselves having to respond to. So some of ERM's early work and some of our work today is about interpreting that regulatory agenda. The survey that we're talking about with you today has been running since 1997, so kind of half that time. Chris and GlobeScan started that before I came on the scene, and Chris, maybe you want to talk about Origins.
Sure.
Yeah,
so
Chris, go ahead and give us an overview as well of the study and its scope.
Yes, so this is one of the thought leadership platforms we've been running as part of our general contribution to the conversation, and also to kind of inform our custom work with clients. But in the late 90s, we thought it was important to galvanize and collect the collective wisdom of this emerging discipline called sustainability or sustainable development, and to tap into experts from business, government, civil society, academia who are working in this space to help them guide what's important in the agenda, what's working, what isn't, what are elements of leadership that are noteworthy and worth replicating or learning from. And so we started this in the late 90s and have been doing it every year since. And with this combination with the Sustainability Institute by ERM, we have this robust approach to try and understand and diagnose, what's working, what isn't, and where are things going.
Now,
Brian.
Sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say, Brian, my organization became a partner to the survey towards the end of its first decade. I've found it so fascinating to watch the evolution of what our global sustainability expert panel has told us about what's happening in the corporate sustainability space, what defines leadership, and how that differs both around the world and over time.
And I'm sure that one of the key things that you've noticed is how the attitudes have changed in different markets. And the pace of change driven by different factors around legislation or perhaps pressure from customers or consumers.
Yes to all of those things. That they've certainly changed differently in each region. There's also been some consistent patterns globally over time, and maybe it's worth trying to move quickly from one to the other. So Chris and I and a colleague, David Grayson, broke down the first 20 years of the survey in a book in 2018 called All In. And we said, there's been kind of three key eras that have passed through here. We've watched folks go through a harm reduction. How do we reduce our impacts? How do we maybe reduce costs? Through an integration era to one that's almost more set by purpose. But all the way through that, we've seen consumer pressure, B2B pressure, translation of this through supply chains, and especially in recent years, an acceleration again of the regulatory pressures that come with new disclosure standards that are spreading worldwide. And some of that regulatory is the quasi-regulatory or almost bully pulpit stuff that can come from the listing requirements of stock exchanges, the global sustainable stock exchanges movement, which is very active in Asia. All these things are pushing companies to evolve and improve the way they tackle sustainability issues.
Now, Chris, could you start by, for this year's survey, give us an overview of the study and its scope?
Yeah, so we surveyed in March 520 experts in sustainability. On average, they have around 15 years of expertise in focusing on ESG and sustainability. So they're deep into the agenda and hard marking. They're quite committed to the agenda. We have about 1 in 5 of those stakeholders are from the Asia Pacific region. So it is global, and we're working to expand the network of experts to contribute to this thought leadership. We asked, it's quite a tight survey and quite focused, but we asked around the issues agenda. We asked around breakthrough recent events that really define the agenda today. We've also explored NGO leadership and corporate leadership, which I think we'll want to probably get into. Just on the first couple of things, and then we can get into the corporate leadership story, which is quite rich, and as Mark said, quite extensive. The issue agenda is pretty consistent around the world. It's climate change and the nature agenda, which includes biodiversity, water, and deforestation as a top tier set of priorities for sustainability ESG. But just below that, there's an important social agenda related to food security, economic inequality, access to education and healthcare that also are quite meaningful and connected to this broader ESG agenda. And we know the S in ESG stands for social, and the interdependency between the environmental and social is one part of the movement that where stakeholders are really embracing and seeing that we need both of these things to work in harmony if we're going to make progress on either of them.
Yeah, and that was interesting, Chris. That was an interesting takeaway that I had as well, because things like biodiversity loss was 86%, water scarcity, 86% as well. But poverty was just right up there at 80%. So that really sort of opened my mind into the fact that it's not just the climate issues that, as you pointed out, poverty, income inequality rank really high up there in the agenda.
I think they're inextricable, Brian, is part of the issue that this is the concept of the just transition, I guess, at one level, that we can't solve for climate change and we can't save nature unless we can connect that to the impacts on people that both of those things have. And we need everybody to get to the other side of the low carbon energy transition that we need to go through. We need to entice everyone that that's a better future for us. So jobs, economic security, access to medicine and healthcare, always a key part of this, even though those dominant environmental issues tend to crowd the top of the league tables. they're not far ahead of the rest.
Now, in terms of the challenges, have you found distinct differences in terms of the priorities or the ranking that, say, for example, certain regions placed over other regions? So, for example, in the Asia Pacific, 93% of experts continue to rank climate change as the most urgent challenge. But did you see significant differences between regions?
Not dramatic. I mean, climate change is the most important everywhere, and it is the big gorilla in this conversation. And as we understand it more deeply, as Mark said, it connects to the social agenda. There are those who are most exposed to climatic impacts are usually the least able to adapt to it because of poverty issues and economic development issues. It's also clearly connected to the economy, and in BizTech Asia, you're very well aware of the future of the economy is clean and green and very technologically driven, which requires that connective tissue to climate change too. So that's everywhere. In parts of Africa and Latin America, more so, but also Southeast Asia, the development agenda is very strong. You know, poverty alleviation as being a priority as part of the agenda critical. And that this goes back to the origins of this discussion, which really began at a critical mass level in 1987 with the publication of Our Common Future, a UN document where the term sustainable development was coined as a way to bridge the sustainability environmental agenda, largely driven by the global north, and the development agenda, largely driven by the global south. And we sometimes forget that's the origin, and it kind of weaves along and gets into environmental stuff, but it's always come back to that connection between those two aspects of it.
And that's something that's often, you know, Chris, you've brought up a very important point. That's a historical thing that often people don't make the connection. Obviously, they maybe don't have the context, but it's worth pointing out. I mean, and I appreciate that you pointed that out again to give people context.
It's a historical piece that's still so alive today, that same debate about development, energy security, the right to develop resources and minerals that northern countries have largely already taken advantage of and other economies want to still develop. You know, it's a real tension and important issue to resolve in the sustainable development issue or debate now in 2023 as well.
So Mark, perhaps you could start by giving us some key findings of this year's survey, particularly from the corporate perspective.
Sure, Brian. Yeah, we've seen a steady trend in expectations around corporates that they demonstrate that they're integrating the issues. So we've almost seen a pattern over a decade plus of companies first stepping forward and recognizing the agenda, then making commitments to it, be that reducing water use, energy use, setting a net zero target more recently, committing themselves to the just transition, backing the Paris Agreement. But we're past now the stage of education and development, and the evidence that our experts responding to the survey really want to see in terms of how they judge which corporates are leaders is evidence of integration of these issues into core strategy. And then further, they want to see a demonstration that it's starting to affect the business model of these organizations. A simple example of that at a base level might be the way the automotive industry is moving from internal combustion engines to EVs. But that's not the whole of sustainable transport, but it signals a big shift in an industry that it had been doing essentially the same thing for 100 years. And so folks are looking in, wondering how other industries will make similar transitions that change energy use, still provide the services we need, enable economies and societies to move forward, but with less impact.
Now, Chris, do you want to add something to that as well?
Yeah, and what's the Mark referenced earlier, the trend, the evolution of recognized leaders according to stakeholders across the world, and we think we're in this different emerging era that we've called the regenerative era, where companies are recognized for attributes that relate to net positive impact. So net positive environmentally, where, for example, on water issues, you would actually find a way to save or conserve or protect more water than you use. Net positive social is how do you actually create more overall economic development activity than what you might do or take out. And this net positive framework is required according to these experts because of the dire climactic, biodiversity, and inequality crisis facing the world. And so we have to catch up. And those companies that are able to demonstrate models and approaches that actually deliver on that idea of overextending and over delivering social and environmental benefits are viewed as leaders.
Now, and I want to zoom in on the Asia Pacific context. In Asia, a lot of the sustainability agenda has been driven by a couple of key things. One is legislation, and that's new legislation that has been introduced across the region. Two, it's something that both of you have alluded to earlier in the conversation around stock markets, putting in rules and regulations to ensure that listed companies basically start on the sustainability agenda, and they've given them frameworks. The third area is then also customers, basically, or B2B customers, the likes of Unilever, for example, who leaders in the space, forcing companies within their supply chains to comply or be left out of the supply chains. Give us a sense of what's happening in Asia from your lens.
Those patterns are good ones to highlight, Brian. And what we see is the strongest regulatory trends probably are coming from especially Europe and somewhat North America. And so you got into the space of companies being required by stock exchanges to advance their sustainability disclosures. And maybe the biggest mover on that globally right now is the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that is emerging in Europe. But that regulatory initiative affects not only companies headquartered in Europe, but folks in their supply chains. It's touching companies globally. And we're seeing copycat regulation or legislation emerge in other nations. You've got the Singapore Monetary Authority is a body that's put some effort behind this. You have legislation or regulation emerging in markets like Australia. Japan has basic climate disclosure regulation on the books. China's developing stuff in this area as well. And all of this is disclosure led. There's sometimes frustration with that it's just reporting, but I think it underscores the importance of transparency, that we have to see what these companies are doing first, so we can then set targets and metrics to move them forward. But it's happening all over APAC, it's happening all over the world, even though there's a concentration of it kind of pushing out of Europe that's maybe setting the pace for this agenda globally.
Now, in terms of leadership, in corporate leadership, Unilever has been holding the top spot for over a decade. But we've got new leaders now. Maybe you could highlight some of the companies that are recognized as leaders in this space.
Yeah, globally, Patagonia is now seen as the most sustainable company by a margin, but they've grown, and that's largely because of the dramatic announcement they made last year, where they became a fully owned foundation driving environmental NGO work, and their tagline now is "The Earth is our only shareholder." So quite a dramatic, unusual, unorthodox approach. So it's a smaller company, but quite consistent and quite purposeful. Unilever is really maintains a very significant mind share among stakeholders, as does IKEA, Natura & Co, the Brazilian cosmetic company that bought Avon and The Body Shop, so it's now got a bigger global footprint. Mm-hmm. But Danone, Nestle, Google, I mean, these companies all are also and are recognized for leadership from different sectors. Ørsted is one of those companies that's increasingly being viewed by experts as a leadership company. The Danish energy company, it was this transition from fossil fuel to renewables in a very dramatic, short fashion. And then on a local level, I mean, we asked also stakeholders thinking about your local region who are leaders, and Mahindra from India is viewed as a leader because of this as Mark referenced, the transition to sustainable mobility is one key reference point for their leadership, and also any other energy input transition. CDL out of Singapore is viewed as a leader, both because of their focus on green property management, but also their championing of things like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as an extended example of their advocacy and leadership. So there's a really great diversity of perspectives on leadership, but there is this pointed view globally of Patagonia, Unilever, and IKEA, and then regionally, some other companies across Southeast Asia in particular are recognized.
Now, it's been quite an interesting conversation for me to kind of just digest this survey as you know, to research for this, and also a lot of surprises have come up in terms of how far Asian companies have actually come in the Asia Pacific region have come in the last couple of years. Maybe we could get some insights from each of you in terms of what are some of the key things that perhaps leaders should be looking out for in the next 12 to 24 months to advance their sustainability agenda. And we can start with you first, Mark, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Brian. And it's a great question because the agenda is changing so quickly. I think that business leaders everywhere, but business leaders specifically in APAC, need to understand the pace and the content of the shifting regulatory agenda. We went through a decade plus in the corporate sustainability space where it was very private sector led. I always thought that underestimated the need for partnership and collaboration between government and the private sector on these big systemic issues. And we're sort of seeing governments reassert themselves in the conversation in a different way. I think businesses also need to recognize the incredible diversity of topics. You were commenting earlier on the issues beyond climate that our experts push to the fore. Some of those are also environmental, like the nature agenda, which is scaling very fast. Some are social, poverty alleviation, access issues, and otherwise. One thing of a special note from 2022 was the COP15 meeting in Montreal at the end of last year, which was kind of the nature equivalent of the Paris Agreement for climate. So emerging from Montreal, we got a new global biodiversity framework. It's on its way to ratification with almost every country in the world. It commits governments to an early agenda by 2030. There are direct impacts for what that will require of company in terms of disclosures and actions related to nature, very similar to the pattern we've seen with climate over time. Chris, what would you add?
May I build on that? And that's important because that was a Chinese-Canadian hosted summit. It was meant to be in Kunming, China, but delayed because of COVID. But the Chinese government was very aggressive and invested in creating a global framework on nature, which complements the climate agenda. So that's a big deal. I think I would also add plastics as an agenda, and it's a very visceral one in the Asian context. And there's a global plastic treaty trying to be implemented later next year, which will also have significant implications on national regulations and legislation.
Chris, can you zoom in and give us a little bit more details on that? Because I think, as you said, in our region, that plastics is really important.
Yeah, well, this comes from the crisis of the plastic issue, which was one of those things that was kind of below the surface for a long time. And then it emerges into public consciousness across the world, very much through images and visuals. Some people tie it back to a BBC Blue Planet documentary that just showcased the extent of plastic in the oceans in particular. And that has led to, I think, a bubbling up for governments to be involved and pressure on businesses that use and create a lot of plastic. And the solution has been a collaborative governance solution. WWF, the NGO, has been very active in trying to bring the treaty to fruition. And so we have this civil society, governmental, multilateral, as well as corporate engagement to try and find a solution with targets that'll be quite aggressive to reduce and minimize plastic use going forward. But like all these challenges, without that, these are free ridership issues. So one company on its own could do it, but it would be difficult, it would be costly, it would lose potentially market share. And so therefore it's a collective wicked problem that has to be addressed in these multi-stakeholder forums.
There are particular reasons, I think, Brian, why the plastic agenda is so important in APAC. You know, almost all of the ocean-borne plastic that exists presently has flowed in from 4 countries, all in the APAC region. That's not to lay blame there. They're producing that plastic for the world, but that's how it gets into our waterways. So we need local solutions there that will help that.
Which are the 4 countries? I'm sure our audience would want to know.
Ooh, I'm gonna have to go back and double check because I don't want to misspeak on that piece. But if I can put in a reference where you'd find it immediately, Circulate Capital in Singapore is working specifically on this issue, and I actually want to tie it to another point about what business leaders need to understand, and that's the emerging role of finance. So how does the sustainability agenda, how does the ESG agenda affect access to capital, and how can it be brought to bear to solve these problems? Circulate Capital exists to bring investment to bear on the problem of ocean plastic and to stop it at source. We're seeing more and more experiments like that. But at the other end, in terms of funding forward development, banks and institutional investors are getting much more sophisticated at understanding sustainability related risk and opportunity, and that's framing their forward investment decisions. So for businesses to scale and grow in the future, to draw in the capital, they'll need to do that. They'll need to be able to demonstrate that they can lead on the sustainability agenda.
And to build on that, Brian, too, I mean, I think that I think you're right to say when you reference that sustainability is a bit newer in Asia than other parts of the world. I think in some ways people would argue with that sustainable development thinking in a place like Tata, you know, a 170-year-old company, has the origins relate to sustainable development thinking, and it's been there. I think there has been a non-inclusive approach to the agenda to a degree, and I worry about the East-West not working closely enough because we need a global approach to all these things. So I think that's important that we accelerate some of those conversations and dialogue, which is why what you're doing with ESG at BizTech Asia is really important to kind of elevate it and bring different voices to the conversation.
And you know, Chris, if I want to add to that, there are so many myths around the sustainability conversation, one of which is China is the biggest polluter. But on the other hand, China, and I was shocked to find this out a couple of years ago, is the biggest contributor to tree planting by a country mile compared to the rest of the world. If I'm not mistaken, I think China plants 2 trees literally for 1 tree that everyone else plants. I think it's some crazy number like that.
And the biggest solar panel producer, the EV market in China has exploded. Is it close to half of EVs or cars in the country are electric vehicles? So you're right. There's a tale of 2 cities in all these places.
Gentlemen, it's been a fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot. But before we leave, any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with? And I want to start with you, Mark.
I would say that no region should underestimate the role that it's going to play here. I liked what Chris said about the incredible age and wisdom of a company like Tata. And there are family businesses, private enterprises scattered across APAC that have that deep legacy and history. And I don't think it gets talked about enough. And sometimes those are the best kinds of organizations to move sustainability thinking, which is inherently long-term, through. You can get things done on different timelines with that kind of stakeholder arrangement. I'm excited to see further examples of leadership emerging from the region and BizTech Asia, highlighting them, I hope, in coming years.
Chris, how about final thoughts from you?
Yeah, totally agree with Mark. And we're lucky. We're a smaller organization than ERM, but GlobeScan has a new office in Singapore that we're thrilled about, and trying to work with those types of organizations that are family oriented. And they do have a different sensibility and approach to ESG, which is very exciting. But the last thing I would reference is that for business leaders out there, there are 2 things that are happening on ESG and sustainability. One is the irresistibility of it. As values and opportunities around the economy changing, there's money to be made here, and there's a real opportunity to drive growth, good growth, in a different way that aligns with the way the transition that's happening in the world. There's also an inevitability, and when on the legislative element, on the procurement with B2B customers, on consumer preference changes, on scientific scientific approaches and understanding of what's happening, and on the financial markets. All of these together combine to this ecosystem of inevitability that, whether you like it or not, the future will be sustainable, and we might as well be an early first mover to capture those advantages.
On that note, gentlemen, thank you very much for taking your time to come on the show.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Brian.
Brian.
Now, we've been speaking to Chris Coulter. He's the CEO of GlobeScan, and Mark Lee, Director of the Sustainability Institute by ERM. I'm Brian Fernandez, and you've been watching and listening to BizTech's ESG Conversation show. This interview will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.